in archaeology, and they've used remote viewing to look at future events and future happenings, because that time blocks our normal physical senses. But also remote viewing in terms of objects that are hidden or events that happen thousands of miles away. The difference between remote viewing and your prophetic vision or your psychic reading that you call up to get, or you sit with somebody and have them give you a psychic reading, the difference is that remote viewing grew out of the laboratory. The idea that when you say I am a remote viewer, or when you say I did a remote viewing, those of us who have been involved in it hear what you're saying, that this was done under protocol controlled structured conditions. Not, I had a dream last night that my daughter was going to have a car accident, and sure enough she did. I'm a remote viewer. No, that was an accurate prophetic dream. But it wasn't remote viewing, because remote viewing to our standards means that it's done under a specific controlled situation. Usually meaning that you work with another person, an interviewer, and you have somebody called an interviewer or monitor and a remote viewer, and those two people have very distinct roles in the act of perceiving and describing the target, and neither of them have a clue. It's called being blind to the target. Neither of them have a clue as to what is supposed to be described. Let me explain to you what the typical initial protocol at Stanford Research Institute was. We worked with Dr. Puthoff and Russell Targ, and a remote viewer would go out there for evaluation, and in the morning you might have coffee together, and then at about 9:30 you and Russell Targ would be taken away and taken into a room and kept in that room. Once you were in the room, then Dr. Puthoff would generate a random number with his computer, and it would say envelope 152. He would go to the safe and open up and get envelope 152. He had no idea what was in 152, but he would drive away from SRI. When he was a couple of blocks away, he opens the envelope, and it says, go to the marina, go to McDonald's, or go to the wharf, or go to the university tower, whatever is the selected site. And then he would drive to that site. And his job was to interact with the site in some way. If it was a park bench, sit on the park bench. If it was a library, go into the library and look at books. If it was McDonald's, go in and order a burger and a shake. Or he was supposed to interact with this area in the normal course of how you're supposed to interact with that area. Meanwhile, back at the room with the remote viewer and Russell Targ, at 10 o'clock, they would say, okay, interviewer would say to the remote viewer, it's now 10 o'clock, describe Dr. Puthoff's location. And then they would attempt to describe where he was. The interviewer asking questions like, tell me more about that. You mentioned such and such. Tell me a little bit more about that. Why did you say that? Don't get too far afraid now. Just tell me the raw perception you had. Don't draw any conclusions. So working together, then they would attempt to describe, where did Dr. Puthoff go? So when I say remote viewing, that's what I mean. I mean this very controlled, organized situation. Afterwards, after they tried to describe, then Dr. Puthoff would return, and all three of them would get in the car and go out to the location. And that way, the remote viewer and interviewer would learn, gee, when I talked about the green, that was there, and I talked about a big, tall, white structure, that was there, but when I said red car, that didn't have anything to do with anything. So they learn by seeing it first person and compare it with the kinds of intuitive impressions they had, and learn from that repeated practice. So if you go to get a psychic reading from someone, that's not remote viewing. If you have a prophetic dream, that's not remote viewing. They may be perfectly accurate, and they're certainly psychic perceptions, but within the confines of what is remote viewing, when you're talking to Mr. Lab like me, that's not remote viewing. We mean something different, this controlled procedure, scientifically designed, protocol-driven, structured process. Now, it's time for me to show you some examples of remote viewing, what actual people have done, so that you can see that remote viewing can be accurate, but sometimes it isn't complete. It isn't the be-all, end-all. And that's important to understand because I'm coming out of the intelligence community and having used remote viewing in the intelligence community, trying to sort of, describe for you, yes, it was a useful tool, but it wasn't the ultimate answer. So I'm going to show you some examples. Now, in the explanation that I just gave to you about describe Dr. Pudoff's location, that was the early kind of testing or evaluation of how good are you as a remote viewer. It turns out you don't have to have someone go to the site to describe it. That what is usually done is someone will take a picture of some location, a known location, and they can put it in an envelope, in a sealed envelope. And then all you have to say to the remote viewer is describe the location in the envelope at the time the picture was taken. Describe the location in the envelope at the time the picture was taken. And you always want to put the time in there because remote viewers don't care about time. They might describe it forward or back in time unless you give them directions at the time the picture was taken. Obviously what happens then is you do the remote viewing and then you open up the envelope and show him the picture. You don't have to drive out to it anymore, which opened up the whole world, because you couldn't get on the airplane and fly to Kuala Lumpur after the remote viewing session just to check and see how well you did. It'd be not easier to have a picture of this place and check and see how you did. So it opened up the whole world to remote viewing practice in that way. And that brings another important aspect into this thing about remote viewing, and that of feedback. If the remote viewer is to learn, it's presumed that you need to give him some feedback. You need to give the remote viewer, he or she, some feedback as to how well they did. Now, so that they might learn from their perceptions. And from the scientific point of view, you can't evaluate if remote viewing exists or try to find out how can we do this anyways, unless you actually have some ground truth to compare. Because the way these targets were tested, remember I talked about going out to the site afterwards and then comparing, oh gee, I described the white building correctly, but I missed on this and I missed on that. Well, that isn't the ultimate scientific answer. What they did was they took this description of the big white building and they took 5 other targets. So you had 6 targets altogether. One of those targets was the big white building, and they would give the remote viewer's description and all 6 targets over to a third party who had no idea what the real target was. That's called blind differential discrimination. The judge had to match the remote viewer's description with the 6 targets. And then hopefully they came up with a first place match. This description best matches the big white building, not the wharf, not McDonald's, not the museum, so forth. And that was done by a third party, blind differential discrimination. It was only through that blind differential discrimination that they came up with the statistical validation. Remote viewing is working. Remote viewing really does work. It wasn't just self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of the remote viewer. I mean, you get remote viewers coming back saying, inside, outside, green, confined area. And now that describes everything on the planet, right? You don't get any points for that, kind of thing. Yes, an atrium has an inside-outside feeling and has green things in it. But that doesn't help in the description, Statistically, when you look at blind differential discrimination, that was the only way to judge that it had any validity. Now in this case, we're not going to do blind differential discrimination, but I am going to show you, describe the target in the sealed envelope at the time the picture was taken. And the remote viewer comes back with this kind of a perception. He starts with fragmentary sketches and a few words after spending some mental time figuring out what this might be. So at first blush, when we look at that, if you were an analyst and you were looking at that, is there a clue as to what Joe might be trying to describe there? A bridge is one concept. You have to be really careful here. If you're going to be super analysts, you have to be really careful not to look at that lower structure and see bridge. Okay? That's a big remote viewing mistake, to do a sketch and then say, oh, it looks like a bridge. We're talking about conceptual notions here. What was the other one? Fence, radio tower concept. Okay. Okay. Well, obviously, when you're an interviewer working with a remote viewer, you have to be very careful not to say, tell me more about that bridge, tell me more about that radio tower. You don't know. Okay? And so you have to say, listen, Joe, you've told me about several things here. You seem to have something that goes up in the air in one case, and then you seem to have these girders with X's. Relax a minute, Joe. Relax a minute again, and see if you can't organize these a little bit better for me. Access the target again and see if you can't organize these raw perceptions you've given me. And so he comes back with this. Okay. Now, this turns out to be a very nice remote viewing, and he says it must be a construction site of some kind. As it turns out, it was a construction site. Okay. Now, I showed you this because it's a very good remote viewing. The next ones are going to be a little bit deeper and a little bit different. This is very good. But I do want to point out that Joe didn't say, that's Company 142 construction crew on Highway 356 south of Oklahoma, and they're digging a new trench to, that wasn't all there. Okay. If I ask, where is Mr. Schmutz right now, and Joe's not going to say, Carmack says he's in McDonald's having a hamburger and a second Coke, That's not the way it works. Joe's going to come back and say, I smell food. The color yellow or orange. I smell food. It's a very noisy place. I hear traffic. I keep thinking of those M&M candies. And so he doesn't say, it's McDonald's at the corner of 185th and Main. That is not what a remote viewer will give you in information. Let's look at another one. Okay, we'll look at another envelope. First impression that comes back from the remote viewer is this. Okay? Large stones, angles, something flat and water and a road. Notice how he kind of puts together his concepts up to there. Hard, cold, wet, lead to concrete. People few, sort of water, river. Okay? What's the word on the right? Building. So he tries to put these together, something having to do with concrete, water, building. And that's the way remote viewing should be. You should expect to hear from your remote viewer no more than 3 words. We don't want big, long sentences. We don't want verb construction. We don't want prepositional orientation. I'm looking at a very large object on the left side of the, all those sentences mean there's been a lot of processing time, You want these initial impressions to be very fragmentary words, just rough sketches. And he's lost. I don't know what this is. It's big. There's these, and these, and these, and these. And what do you want? And that's what I got. And so you go back, you say, relax again, focus your attention on the target, and describe these large objects to me and this water. Tell me more about this place. And he kind of reorganizes his thinking, and he comes up with, well, here's where the water is, and here's where those big stones are, and this is the angle, and this is the road and the water here. And not very many people come here, but see where I have them there. And so this obviously looks to us like a dam or a spillway. Okay? But Joe doesn't come back and say, oh, this is the Rivanna River Dam. Okay? He does not come back and say that. So if the, kidnapped child was being held at the Rivanna River Dam, could we find out from Joe's sketches that that's true? Probably not alone. Probably not alone, but if you take those pictures out and you give them to all the policemen and the firemen in the area and all the buildings,